live. Ryan, Michael, welcome.
Hey, Luke. How's it going?
Pretty good. How are you guys?
Good.
I'm doing well. Trying to get over the fact that I've been inside for 2 days and haven't left the house.
Inside your house or inside your head? Because you've been reading Kierkegaard.
Both of them.
So how have you guys? So just to sort of lay out the project that we have here, we've all read Fear and Trembling. I've read it in the past. I know that you've read it in the past as well, Ryan. But we all have this project basically of just exploring this that we've recently read. Michael, did you also recently read it, or was it a while ago for you?
Oh yeah, this is the first time.
Okay. So it's a recent read for all of us, and it's an exploration of it. I'm not an expert in philosophy. I don't think you are either, Ryan. You always say that.
I am not. Look, I'm a software engineer, so you can ask me about code and stuff, but philosophy I'm not. I like reading. I enjoy it. So for me, this is more of a playful hobby and an exploration of the text. I read this about a year ago, but I did an audiobook, and it was a serious drive-by. So I kind of tried to read it more this time, but my comprehension levels are pretty low. As we'll get into, I guess, it's a tough book to get into. The ideas are pretty simple, but the details are tough. So please keep that in mind. I'm a layman, just trying to have fun.
I was on the audio too, and I had to gaze out the window intently the entire time, and because it was tough to listen to.
The philosophic gaze does help comprehension, I've found. If you stare at something, or in Kierkegaard, it just helps a lot.
How about you, Michael?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely not an expert. I guess I studied philosophy in college, but other than that, I had never read anything by Kierkegaard. So this was a first encounter with a philosopher that I've been very excited about for a long time.
What excited you about Kierkegaard? What's the appeal, the initial appeal?
Well, I mean, Karl Jaspers calls him the father of existentialism, and I think that we'll probably get...
We sure will.
That. But some of the ideas that he comes up with are going to have incredible long-term effects on Sartre and Heidegger and a lot of these other philosophers that I think are really important right now. So I wanted to get back to the beginning. Also, just a Christian existentialist in general.
Right. Very paradoxical.
Yeah. And we'll get into how much he likes paradoxes.
Yeah, that's the ultimate paradox right there. An uber-Christian existentialist. It doesn't get any more paradoxical than that.
It's a little weird. But
it is weird.
Read it, it sort of makes sense, and that's what's exciting is how you can reconcile that. But
well, if we hit that right now, then we're going to get lost in the weeds immediately. So
right.
I think the best thing to do is just frame everything. So let's spend a little bit of time just sort of framing the discussion, how it's going to go, and then we'll get into it. So I sort of see it as I want to define some terms so that everyone has the terms. But before we do that, maybe Michael and Ryan too, to some extent, if you can lay out the sort of background, the context, social context, and some of the actual biographical information about Kierkegaard. And then, Ryan, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about also the just the way that it's framed and the way that it's laid out. So we can get into that. Then we can go through some definitions in sort of a breeze through fashion, a drive-by fashion. And then I'd like to just get into the sections, because basically it's laid out in sections. So we'll get into the sections, and I have some questions that we can go through within the sections, and we'll do it like that. And if people are commenting, then we will be taking comments throughout, but not necessarily right when the comments pop up. So that's how it'll go, if that works.
Thumbs up. Sounds good.
So, Michael, can you just lay out a little bit of the historical context and the biographical background?
Yeah, so Kierkegaard is born in 1813 in Copenhagen, Denmark. And Denmark has just gone through a pretty significant change from a feudal system to a capitalist system. And the effects that this is going to have are that it is difficult, at least according to Kierkegaard, what he notices, it's difficult to become who you are because of the social identities that were unusually fluid at this time, moving from the feudal to the capitalist, and that there was this proliferation of normalizing institutions that were turning people into pseudo-individuals. So Kierkegaard notices this, and he takes this and the other problem of how to be a Christian in Christendom. So the other problem that he notices, besides the individualism, is that Christianity, the Danish are almost all Christians, but they're incredibly complacent, and they think that it's easy to be a Christian. And so Kierkegaard is going to come back and kind of challenge that. So he is, like I said, born in 1813, and then the other really important biographical fact I think that factors in to Fear and Trembling is that right before this was written, he broke off a very serious engagement with a woman that he loved very much named Regina Olsen. And he did that because he believed that he could not live his philosophy the way that he wanted to if he married her. And that's more complicated that we can get into later.
How old was he?
28 when he broke up with his
28
fiance.
Yeah.
At least I had in mind that's Mike.
Yeah. And then I liked that tidbit, so I'm going to share it again. We talked about earlier that two of his biographers, or one of his biographers, believes that the reason why on the day that Fear and Trembling is published, he also publishes another book, Repetition. And they believe that he published these two books on the same day because he experiences profound disturbance of seeing Regina, his fiancée, or his ex-fiancée, nod twice to him in church on Easter Day, April 16th, 1843. So he has this experience. She nods twice, and he goes on this repetitive nod, right? So he goes on to write these two books and publishes them on the same day.
That's pretty intense. That must be quite a nod. I mean, that's a very intense trigger. Yeah, I'd like to see it. I'd like to see that in a soap opera. So okay, so that's the main background information. I think we'll probably get into how the relationship and the breakup ties into some of the things that he shares later on to sort of get across some of the key ideas of the philosophy, especially maybe the Night of Infinite Resignation and a few other things. But you want to share anything else, Ryan, on the personal details?
I do. I just want to add that he was the youngest of 7, and it says here that all of his sisters and 2 of his brothers and his mother all died before his 21st birthday. His father was a very religious person, and Søren's childhood was a very isolated and unhappy one. So if you look at the themes of philosophers that we're reading, they didn't really have rosy childhoods, and maybe that's a thematic theme through all these existential philosophers, but they faced suffering at an early age which shaped them. And the other thing to say is that he was a bit of a ladies' man, I guess. 'Cause I know we're not going to go off script, but he wrote this other book called Either Or, which got The Seducer's Diary, which is another dialectical comparison about romance and marriage. But I think he grappled with this idea of how does he show romance, how does he show love, and that's seen in this work as well. He also died young, so I think he died at age 42, which may not be young. For me, that's young. I'm almost 42.
It's pretty young.
Yeah. And he had tuberculosis and just died from a spinal injury. So poor dude did die at a pretty young age.
Didn't you mention something about how someone thought that he was supposed to die younger? Who said that? He was destined to...
His father believed that for the origins of this guilt are disputed, but his father had this incredible amount of guilt, and he believed that all of his children, all 7 of his children, would be taken from him before the age of 34, which is obviously the year that Jesus never reached. So he has this deep belief in this, and all of them do except for Søren Kierkegaard and Peter Kierkegaard. And they're the only ones that reach past the age of 34, and that at least some biographers point to as the reason why Kierkegaard was writing so prolifically before the age of 34, because he never thought he would reach it, and when he did reach his 34th birthday, he counted it as a miracle.
So he bought into his father's conception of his destiny.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just certainly something, if someone is telling you that you're going to die at 34, it's just something about that I think really motivated him. I'm not
Especially
sure.
if it's your father, yeah.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Can I add one more nugget here on his background? Is that So he was a really bright student, just like Nietzsche and some of these other philosophers were. But he spent 7 years in college doing theology and liberal studies. But he was also known as a party animal. So the Kierkegaard parties were like the best ones to go to. So a little bit of insight there.
I did not pick, because I try to, when I'm reading, I try to pick up on things that I don't know, but I can maybe glean from the nuances of someone's writing. And I did not get that. There is no, it's quite pious writing in a lot of ways. I didn't get any party life, cocaine, anything like that.
Immanuel Kant was a party animal as well, FYI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it goes without saying, yeah. Okay, well, so basically this is a book about faith. That's what this is about. It's Kierkegaard's exploration of faith via Abraham. So, Ryan, you want to talk about a little bit about the structure and sort of why he presents it the way that he does?
That's a good point. So the structure of the book is laid out in a particular way. I think and correct me here, Mike or Luke, if I'm wrong, but he calls it a lyrical dialectic or a dialectical lyric. And he wants to have half the book be more like poetry and half the book be like more of a rational expounding of the facts. And the issue that he's really facing for him, being an existentialist, he wants to look at the individual. So the individual in this case is Abraham. He thinks that's the most important individual in the Bible, in Christianity, that needs to be looked at from an existentialist point of view, from his Abraham's individual point of view. And he looks at Abraham, the story of Isaac specifically. So Abraham, I didn't know this. I'm not been brought up a Christian. I've never been to a church, but I saw that Abraham was asked by God to kill his own son, Isaac, who was a young kid, like 10 years old. So Abraham takes him up to the mountain, goes to kill him. What was that, Luke?
I think he was a teen. I think he was a young teen, maybe 12. I don't remember.
Okay. And then he goes to kill him, and then an angel steps out and says, hey, stop, kill this lamb instead. So he's like, all right, phew, thank you, and doesn't kill his son. But I think what Kierkegaard gets at is how can someone be good whilst killing their son? That doesn't make sense to me. We have ethical ideas, what ethics is, and we have this idea of aesthetics, which might be love, beauty, et cetera, but how can I possibly be good whilst killing my son? And that's the idea that he tries to break down and analyze. He does it in a certain structure. He has the first part, as I said, is a lyrical structure, I believe. I could have it the other way around. But he looks at it from the point of view of a child who's told the story of Abraham and how that child feels. Then he gives a speech in praise of Abraham to sort of look at it from another angle. But then he breaks into the 3 major problems that he wants to address. And he calls them problem 1, 2, and 3. And that's what we're going to talk about, I think, mostly. Problem 1 is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Teleological meaning, if there's a purpose in life, should we do something bad in order to achieve that purpose? So is killing okay under the right circumstances?
Well, there's more nuance than that, but yeah.
I'm sorry, yeah. The second, is there any absolute duty to God? So must I always obey my God or whatever God means to me? And then the second is, was it ethically defensible for Abraham to conceal his purpose from Sarah, his wife, from Eliezer, I think his maid, and Isaac, his child? He didn't tell them he was going to kill them or tried to kill them. He just concealed it. So is that bad that he lied or not? So they're the 3 main questions.
Or remain silent, rather. Right.
Correct, yeah.
I'm going out. Where are you going? I'll tell you later. I can't say.
Outside of that knife.
Don't worry about it. Knife throwing practice.
Something I feel like we would be remiss in not mentioning right off the bat is that this was published under a pseudonym, right?
Yes.
Johann de Silencio.
Do you know why he does that?
Sorry?
Do you know why he does that?
Well, yeah. So he later on in his life would say that if you're going to quote any of the pseudonymous works, I hope that you would quote them under the actual pseudonym and not my own name. So that's the tricky thing, and I think where you'd find more of the party animal is that he's getting his 2 heroes are Jesus and Socrates, and he has this irony. He writes his college thesis on irony, and he loves this sort of ironic smile that he is cultivating throughout this thing. So, yeah, he publishes this under the pseudonym so that he can always maintain distance from it, and this Johann de Silencio is not a Christian. he continually says, I can't really get into it. I admire it so much and I understand it, but I just can't fully grasp. Can't really get into it. You can't believe it. So that is one of the main differences between him and Kierkegaard. And then he has that very puzzling epigraph at the beginning that kind of, I think, gives a hint as to how the book is meant to function. But I don't know if we'll probably get to that later.
I wonder to what extent that also has an effect on the reader, because I don't know about you guys, but the more I know about a band, the less I like them in a way. I don't care about their personal details, and sometimes when I learn about those things, it affects me. I don't know to what extent he was known by people as a philosopher or an intellectual, and also maybe as a partier or whatever, and that might have had an effect on people's perception of his work via his reputation. I mean, I don't know, but I wonder.
It's easier, I think, to believe in ideals, and that's why we have characters and archetypes, because once something becomes flawed, like a real three-dimensional person, we can't believe in it as well. I think that's what we go and look at faith and what faith is, but it's kind of a belief in an ideal in a way. But that's, I think you're saying an important point, that's why he had this character be the author, because then you could believe the character more than you would a real person.
And it does honestly give it a sense of, because you know that Kierkegaard is a devout Christian, but to me, it doesn't read that way. It reads as a great existential text. It reads as applicable to a lot of other things. It reads as universal in a lot of ways, that even though it's about Christianity, it's somehow much more universal. And I wonder to what extent the lens of this fictional character allows for that, or creates that sort of the right mood to go through it.
Yeah.
So I want to just quickly go through, just so that everyone's on the same page, also that we're on the same page about some of the terms, just so that when we talk about them as we go along, we're not talking about different things, because some of them are a little bit not confusing, but open to subjectivity. I mean, you could understand it a couple of different ways, I think. So maybe we can just go through a few of those. I sort of have them paired together. So the universal and the ethical is paired together.
Yes.
How do you guys see the universal and the ethical in a sort of simple way of saying it?
That would be truth. If you're going to court and you put your hand on the court thing, the Bible, I guess, and say, I swear to tell the truth, that's being ethical. And there's an absolute objective truth. That's the way, and it's universal. That's the way I see it.
And you could write it down in a book. You could say, absolutely. Law number 1, Hammurabi's code, this is it. You can go read it in the center of town if you want to.
Right,
yeah.
Right. I think that this is, again, drawing on a lot of his ancient Greek predilections. So he's drawing on the Socratic and the Platonic idea of truth being eternal and universal. And he's trying to reconcile that with, as a Christian, you cannot believe that. Because as a Christian, there was a point in which a new truth came into the world when Jesus was born. So he is why he has this sort of almost hierarchy of the aesthetic into the ethical into the religious is because, and not to jump ahead, but that's purely just to say that there is this ethical system that is universal, like you were saying, and then we get into a higher system that is the religious truths that are particulars. And I think,
and you need that as a framework, because then you can put pegs in it and you can hang things on it. Because if you don't have those 3 levels that you can hang other things on, then you're sort of in a wash of ideas. And so he has to build that structure throughout. It's necessary.
Isn't there ethics in the Bible through the 10 Commandments? Isn't that like a form of ethics, universal ethics as well?
But that's where you would have a difference between, for example, the book of Judges, the book of Numbers, which is just a gigantic list of ridiculous rules, which might mean something in a certain context, and you could say, okay, they had these codes and these laws, and then you read something like the book of Job, and it's heightened, and you read something like the story of Abraham and Isaac, and it's heightened. You read the creation story and it's heightened. So there are within one text, there are different kinds of things. And so I would say that the Numbers and Judges are more code structures and secondary to the sort of the heightened stories.
And it's important to remember that Kierkegaard is Lutheran, so he is dwelling more than a Catholic might on the personal relationship with God. So I think that, yes, there are the Ten Commandments, and those would be more of an ethic to Kierkegaard, purely because they could apply to everyone. But as you're going to see, Abraham broke one of the commandments, thou shalt not kill, or he was about to. I mean, he didn't, but he was about to. This also, another thing we should point out is that the Ten Commandments come significantly after Abraham in the Bible. So it's not as though he's actually breaking a commandment. The commandments aren't around.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
It's not retroactive. You can't go to jail for commandments that are written 1,000 years later. And then there's the sort of base level, the aesthetic, and he also puts personal there, but you'd have to take personal particular and put it both on the lowest rung and the highest rung, but not the middle rung. The middle rung is the universal and the ethical. The highest rung is the religious, the transcendent, is faith, and the lowest rung, which is also personal or can be particular, but also the lowest rung, which is the aesthetic, which is below the ethical, is also personal, is also hidden, is also by itself. So you have to put that one in both places. The ethical or the aesthetic goes on the bottom rung, and then the personal and the particular is what he calls it goes on both. Is that how you guys would put it?
He's saying that like there's the ethical laws, the universal ethics, and I can have like an appreciation of beauty or something, and that's a personal belief that's not part of the universal ethic, and that's fine. But then if I were to commit a crime in the name of love, that would for me put me above the universal ethic. Is that what he's saying?
Well, not necessarily. That wouldn't put you above, because you have to be careful. If you're above the universal ethic, then you have to be steeped in the universal ethic first in order to transcend it and be righteous in doing so. But if you kill someone for love and you're not Abraham and you don't do so in faith, but you do it because you're a jealous lover, then you're merely below the ethical. You're below the universal. That's how I understood it anyway.
What he's saying is basically giving us all the loopholes where we're allowed to break the universal ethic. And I think this book describes a lot of them, and he says there are certain reasons when it would make sense that you're allowed to break a universal ethic. That'd be like ultimately Abraham, which is the highest reason why, and he'll go into why. But there's others he gives, and we're jumping ahead, but he talks like the tragic hero, the aesthetic hero, the poet, and ways that they can break the universal ethic as well, and if it would be okay.
Well, but I would. Well, let's get into that. But actually, as far as my understanding was that they're not breaking the universal ethic. That the tragic hero, the person who kills for justice, is operating within the universal ethic, and the universal ethic itself can evolve. They don't supersede it. They are still within it. We can talk about it later. But anyway, absurdity and paradox are the other two. So absurdity is, as far as I understand it, the leap off the cliff of faith is the thing that doesn't make sense. Why would I jump off of a cliff? And yet it's the only thing I can do in order to be faithful or to actually have faith.
He kind of joins three terms together. He joins absurdity, which is the ability to have two opposite ideas in your mind and appreciate them fully and not be fazed by the fact they're contradictory. He links that with faith as a paradox, but he also links it with doubt. And he says faith is really a lot like doubt. If you can just doubt to the fullest degree, doubt everything, then you're a person who's steeped in faith.
We'll definitely get there because that's Faust, right? That was
what, sorry?
That's Faust, right? We'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then the last two or the last three things. The tragic hero, which you talked about, which is the one that is sanctioned by culture and the one that demands tears, the one that is understood by their tragic action. And I would say, as my understanding, operates within the ethical or the universal sphere. But then there's the Knight of Infinite Resignation, which is a different character. And the Knight of Infinite Resignation is one who is one step away from the leap of faith. It's the highest point that you can reach on your own before the absurd leap, and then we can get into the specifics of that. Is that about right?
Yeah. And I think it might be helpful to point at some of the examples he used of a tragic hero. I think just for our purposes, if we could all just use Agamemnon, I
That's
think
a good one. Yeah.
know the story of Agamemnon pretty well. But in case anyone doesn't, it's Agamemnon had to sacrifice his daughter in order to appease the gods so that the wind could blow again, I think, and he could sail for Troy. And when after the Trojan War ends and he goes home, Clytemnestra will kill him and the concubine that he brought back from the Trojan War, Cassandra, both because Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter and because of the concubine. But Kierkegaard doesn't really mention the concubine as much. But I think what's important is this parallel between Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter and Abraham going to sacrifice Isaac, and how they, even though it seems like the same action, they actually are completely different and exist on totally different planes, I suppose. One on the ethical, the other on the religious.
And it's on the ethical and the universal ethical because when you hear the story, you go, yeah, okay, I get it. That makes sense. I can buy that. So it's still within that plane of the ethical. And Abraham is steeped there, but has to transcend it. Yeah. Go ahead.
And that's exactly right. Like that's when Agamemnon, why he was like inverted commas right in sacrificing his daughter, was because he did it for the sake of his people, the collective. Whereas Abraham had no collective, no reason to kill his son other than, meh, God told me to. So Abraham still, you'll find out Kierkegaard said Abraham was still right, but just for a completely different reason that Agamemnon was right, and actually for a higher reason. But
he was righteous and therefore deserves to be the father of faith. And Agamemnon is like 10,000 other dudes who have killed for the right reason, right? Who have done something quote unquote terrible for a reason that still exists within our ethical domain. When you say ethics, I think it's important to be very careful with the word ethics, because ethics by itself, we think of ethics and we go, oh, right and wrong. In terms of the law, what is the law? But it's not quite that. It includes murder. You can ethically kill someone, like right. Agamemnon might fall into that category.
And ethics, I think he's using the Hegelian idea of ethics is that an ethic belongs to a group of people. If you're a member of that group of people and what you did is okay by the majority of that group of people, it's good.
Yeah.
And that's what's ethically good. So that's people go to war, they shoot and kill soldiers and stuff. Most Americans like, no, that's cool, do it. So it's actually a good action ethically, as opposed to the murderer who does it not for the will of the nation, just on his own accord.
Right. The last term I wanted to just mention is that we might bring up is the double movement. Do either of you guys have a thought, have an understanding of what that is?
Is that resignation and faith, or is that a different?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I got it. You want to explain that?
Well, he talks about the step before having faith is resignation, and that's kind of more like an apathy where you say, I've realized that nothing matters. And he says, and a lot of people think that they are spiritual because they have this resignation, but he says, no, that's not it. The next step is to have the faith paradox, which is realizing that nothing matters and realizing that everything matters at the same time, and having them both together as completely opposed and acting as if everything matters while nothing matters. I think that's what he says. That's the next step after resignation, is to move into like a night of faith. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that regrasping of the finite comes from specifically in relation to the virtue by which you have a relationship with God. So, and this relationship shouldn't have any sort of dependence upon calculations or understanding. So it is by virtue of the absurd that you then regrasp the finite.
I would agree with that completely, except I would take out the word God and say whatever it is that is the object of the absurd leap, because maybe we can talk about this later. I think shamanism fits into this model very well. The shaman is this sick man or sick woman who transcends and mediates the ancestral plane that is this completely unknowable place, and each time is a unique, deranged experience you're leaping into the unknown each time, which is not really God. It's I guess that would be the sacred as opposed to the profane, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can get into that later, but
that's important though, because that's why Kierkegaard can be Christian or existentialists can be atheists. They just believe in this thing that's like absurd, and that could be a God figure. It could be just an absurd endpoint. But I think it could be a shaman believing in something that's an absurd endpoint. Yeah.
Popping a mushroom and zipping off into the ancestral planes.
On the topic that we're the last definition, I think certainly we should bring up is dread or angst.
Oh yeah.
That's what's going to be a huge takeaway for the existentialists. Kierkegaard means it a little bit differently than the existentialists will eventually take it, but Kierkegaard means essentially the double face of having the anxiety of making choices for all of eternity, because your choices are going to depend on the fate of your soul, but you have this anxiety about the choices that you're going to make for all of eternity, but you also have this radical excitement and freedom that's coming from those choices. So this double face is going to make up his idea of angst and dread, and is going to be, I mean, the Sarge is going to say, well, actually, you're making these choices for all of mankind, and that's where the anxiety comes from. But there's still that other side of the radical freedom. So they seem to take out the God part, the making choices for all of eternity, but they keep the radical freedom and the excitement that comes from that.
I think then it's as good a time as any to just talk about why Kierkegaard is considered to be the father of existentialism. So you mentioned the angst that comes with unlimited freedom, but then also there is the responsibility to move toward the state of infinite resignation. There is the duty or responsibility to take deliberate action towards something, which is also pretty fundamental to existentialism. Ultimately, you're responsible for the meaning that your life has, and that is moving toward, if maybe in this case, moving toward the state of being a knight of infinite resignation.
And that makes it teleological. Existentialism, even if it can be atheistic, it's still teleological, because that movement you're talking about is a movement towards self-realization and self-authenticity, which is a movement of resignation, but then the double movement into the being able to understand contradictions as paradoxes. I think it makes it teleological.
Right. Well, I mean, making choices for the eternity of your soul has responsibility involved in it. The existentialists will need to re-grasp that, take back that responsibility and put it on the individual, because there isn't going to be a judge at the end that's going to hold you responsible and accountable for what you do. You have to do that for yourself. But the one of the things that's going to be huge as well, as we were talking about a little bit, is the emphasis on the individual, and how in Kierkegaard's Denmark, people are believing that they are Christian and that they want to go beyond being Christian, and they're like, okay, so what's going to come next? And I think that, like, the one of the best motivations for this book is Kierkegaard going, okay, so you're a Christian, so if God tomorrow told you that you needed to sacrifice your kid, you would do it, right? And everyone's like, and they're like, but so I mean, what was really powerful to me was the ending, when he's talking about how we believe that we inherit more than we actually do inherit from the older generation. So, like, faith is like ballet, or like dance. You need to start at the beginning with the most basic moves. It's not like science, where we can just suddenly, like, teach someone about Newtonian physics and they don't have to figure them out on their own. It's like dance, where you are practicing from day one the most basic movements before you can build up to something greater. And you're never, just because the older generation may be have a certain degree of faith, you are not born into that same degree. You have to work up to it again.
you have to earn it. And I think you said the end, he ties that as well to the beginning, which I think is a good way to start. But in the preface, he says exactly that. He says that these days ideas can be had dirt cheap. And I think it's like what you're saying, Michael, ideas can be traded in books and sent around, and we have all these ideas, scientific ideas or literary ideas, but faith is something that's a passion, and then it's purely experiential, and it has a value that's much, much more than dirt cheap. It is actually extremely valuable and must be earned, and it costs a lot to earn, and you have to earn it individually.
Well, two things about that. Faith is a passion. It's also the highest passion. And the second thing is that it's interesting that both the preface and the epilogue begin with this capitalist language of trading and dirt cheap and putting a price on ideas, which is, I think, to keep in mind, a totally relatively new idea to Denmark. This is not like putting prices on ideas. He's using all this capitalist language, and I was really interested at why he was doing that, especially at the beginning and at the end, about that we're basically auctioning off ideas, and they are becoming cheaper and cheaper to where people won't even bid on them anymore.
But there's also there's an extent to which it's human nature to default to saying that you know something and even thinking that you know it when you actually don't know it, because the idea of Abraham and the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac is a meme that you can grab onto, and like you were saying, you inherit faith. So that's been done. I've received the meme by hearing the story. Once I've heard the story, somehow I've attained it. Now that I've attained it, what's the next thing, right? But the point is, you have to dwell on the thing, because, as you were saying, it's like ballet. You don't know it by hearing it from others. You know it by experiencing it and thinking through it.
He also said something about scientists these days start with doubt and end up in certainty. He says, in the past, we actually would start with certainty and end up in doubt. And he wants us to come back to that time where the greatest man is the one who has the most doubt, because he thinks holding on to your doubt in the face of so much certainty that's flown around, these thin, cheap ideas, is the hardest task ever.
I wanted to ask, Michael, you said a couple of minutes ago, you said the more recent existentialists would say everything is within the personal. There's no God that judges you. Were you saying then that Kierkegaard was saying that? Because Kierkegaard, really, the interesting thing I found about this is because he doesn't lay out any case for God, really. I mean, he's not giving many attributes of God. He's not saying, here's what I think God is, here's the kind of dude he is, here's what judgment looks like. None of that stuff. It's all about the internal state of the believer or the non-believer. It's all about internal states, and that's one of the things that makes it universal, because as soon as you do a story of Job, for example, then you become a proponent of a particular worldview or particular religion. It's cultural, and it's sort of in a bubble. It becomes less universal. So I'm just curious what you meant by that judge comment.
So I was just trying to see the move between, because there isn't that much talk about responsibility in Kierkegaard. And I was thinking that one of the reasons why there wasn't that much talk about responsibility is because responsibility, to some extent, is built into the Christian doctrine, whereas after when the existentialists come along and say that there is no God, then you have to take responsibility for your own actions. But I do think that Kierkegaard just, in some passages, is talking about the state of, so for example, when he's talking about the particular above the universal, he says, what happens if you are wrong? And in actuality, you do kill someone, and God wasn't asking you to do that. Well, you should be very, very afraid, because that is going to be not just because you did something wrong, but there will be eternal consequences for your mistakes. So there is this emphasis on God's relationship with the absolute relationship to the absolute, as Kierkegaard repeats that sort of phrasing over and over, the absolute relation to the absolute. And it has to be pure and understanding, so you're not going to make a horrible mistake like killing your son when God didn't ask you to do that. Right. So even though I don't think there is that much talk about heaven or hell, and there's that much talk about Jesus, which I was so fascinated by, especially, and we'll get back to it at some other point. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but when he said that Socrates had the most interesting life because it was the one most full of pain. And that, for a Christian, is like wild to say. Because
unless you're a self-flagellator.
Well, you have Christ as exemplary sufferer. And then you have Socrates who drinks the hemlock without really even noticing that he's doing it.
Yeah.
So I have no idea what to make of that section. And I'd really love to get to it at some point. But I think that's all I was saying, was that there's not as much responsibility here, and the existentialists are going to put more responsibility on your own actions because the responsibility is more built in to Kierkegaard than I think it will be up for the later existentialists.
But there is a sense in which it is also your own action for yourself in the traditional existentialist sense, because he shares the 4 stories, one of which is Abraham, who, and actually that's where I want to go, is he kills Isaac and he comes back and he doesn't understand what he did. Or, they lay out the four different scenarios. In those scenarios, the consequences of the incorrect action, as judged by or judged in comparison to the true act of faith, is an internal consequence. It's not hell. A lot of this is dealing with the finite. The finite is the here and now. The finite is Abraham believing that he's actually going to get his son back, even if he kills his son. Somehow that's true. Somehow, even though I've given up, I've resigned all of my interest in this woman I love, somehow I know I'm going to get her back. How is that possible? But it's all finite. It's in this life.
Right.
And so there's a sense to which I think Kierkegaard, maybe you're right about that, but I think there's a sense to which he really wants to focus on the internal state of each person rather than necessarily the ethical judgment, because ethics would probably judge both people. The person who killed and wasn't asked by God to do it, the psychopath who drowned her baby in a bathtub, and also Abraham. The ethical would judge them both as probably criminals in a sense, right? So so I'm interested in the internal state even more, because I think that's the profound takeaway from this. So I think we can get into those 4. Maybe we can get into those 4 scenarios.
May I add, because I think that's a great segue. Like we covered the premise, and you're going to the attunement section, which is the first one, right, about the child. To give a snapshot, I think at least from my perspective, I'd love to hear what you all think. But Kierkegaard, he wants to show us that faith or doubt or this paradoxical way of being is something that can only be experienced. And he shows this through the story of a child who is told the story of Abraham. And then he sits us inside of the child's mind and says, how do I experience that story? And then we hear 4 different narratives from the child. 4 scenarios from the child of how that child would feel if they were Abraham. And we can see through the 4 different scenarios of different plausible feelings, neither of them or none of them allow us to actually feel how Abraham must have actually felt. Did I get that the right way, or is that what the purpose of that chapter was?
I saw it as foreshadowing ideas that are later, because I think that it's foreshadowing it probably has multiple purposes, but I think it's trying to get you to get used to the idea of putting yourself into the internal state of various characters, whether it's the tragic hero or it's Abraham or whoever. It's preparing you for that, and it's also, I think, laying out the idea or hinting at the idea or suggesting the idea of, hey, I'm going to be talking about ethical versus religious. I'm going to be talking about these 2 things, and you got to be ready for that. So when you talk about, for example, I think it's the third scenario. It's he misunderstood the test, right? He thought he was proving his love for his son. I think it's the third one. He thought he was proving his love for his son, and so he went to God and said, I can't do it because I love my son too much. That is the ethical test. He thought he was going through an ethical trial. In that case, if you have it, go ahead.
I have the 4. I kind of summarize them. I can give the 4 things, and we can dig into them. Is that all right? Or okay, so step 1 was Abraham leaves with Isaac. Sarah watches them depart. This kid's imagining it. They travel for 3 days. Isaac doesn't understand and gets upset. And Isaac says, what's going on? And then basically Abraham says, I am lying. This is not God's command telling me to kill you. It's me. I'm an evil man, and that's why I'm killing you. Therefore, he goes to kill his son, and the son is able to say, please, God, save me. The son dies, keeping his faith with God, but hating his father. And the father is happy that he lied because he saved his son's faith.
Right.
That's one example.
Yeah, that's number one, right? And the blackening breast as well.
I think it could be important, at least for the first one, he doesn't kill Isaac.
He doesn't.
One of them, I don't know.
He does in 2, I think. In 2 he does, in 2 he doesn't.
Yeah, because it's important because in some of them he's fantasizing or imagining what if it actually went this way.
Right.
So, like, what he's writing about at the beginning is that he wishes that he could have been there on the 3 days ride to Mount Moriah. What do they talk about? And how did when Abraham is bringing Isaac to the mount to offer him up as an offering, how did he console him? And then this is how he consoled him. He lied to him and said because Isaac could not understand him, it would be better for him to not lose his fucking God.
Doesn't he kill him in the first one, though? He that's compared to blackening the breast, right? That one is associated with the woman who blackens her breast to turn him off. But basically, it's when you want to break up with your girlfriend, but you don't have the guts to do it, and so you become a monster and make her break up with you,
right.
Basically.
That's the number 1 play. He talks about that later as well in the book where he does that, the merman.
But does he kill in that one or not? I think he does, right?
I have to look it up.
I mean, it says, but Abraham in a low voice said to himself, O Lord in heaven, I thank thee. After all, it is better for him to believe that I am a monster rather than that he should lose faith in me. But he never plunges the knife in, and that's important because to that extent, he does exactly what he did in the Bible. This could be the story. It just is more fleshed out.
Right.
And
he dies believing, though. That's the point, right?
Yeah. Well, the point would be that he would die believing. But it's important to also remember that that's exactly what Kierkegaard did to Regina. Is he basically said that he was a scoundrel, didn't care about her, and that made it easier to break up.
I'm sure we've all been there. I've done that. You want to read through the other ones, Ryan?
Basically, number 2, he says, same story. He imagines going on the ride to the mountain, Abraham. He goes to slay Isaac, but the sheep comes. He kills the sheep instead. But then Abraham goes back down after having it all done and thinks to himself, I can't believe God asked me to do that. I'm never going to believe again. That's another likely outcome that could occur. Do you want the next 2 or?
Yeah, just go through them.
Real quick, okay. The last one was what he went to the mountain with his son, and then he says, I can't do this, and begs God, please make me not kill my son. That was the 3rd one. And the 4th one was him absolutely Abraham refusing to kill Isaac, but Isaac seeing a knife in his father's clenched hands. And he doesn't kill him, but Isaac gets a sense that something's up, and Isaac comes back and loses his faith in his father. So
where his fist is shaking in despair.
Yeah, because his father looks like he's losing the plot kind of thing.
Yeah. He's losing his nerve for sure, and that I don't know why that specifically would cause Isaac to lose his faith, but whatever. You have to just accept it as it is.
But isn't he getting at? He's saying these 4 stories. There's just a bunch of Isaac and Abraham. You need to know more. You need to know how is his fist clenched and shaking? How is this happening? And there's so many questions left unanswered that cannot be answered unless you experience that story yourself. And that's what the child wishes for, is a wish to experience it, but be there and watch it happen live.
So it's not like these are the only 4 stories that you could imagine. I think he's saying, here's 4, and you can come up with some. Let's try to put yourself in this.
Michael, you look...
Yeah, well, there's the other thing is that how does he do it? He can't do it these ways. He must do it in the way that is the most faithful, and that is the way that the Knight of Faith would do it. Because I think that Abraham is going to be the archetypal Knight of Faith, and the way that he would have done, a lot of the descriptions of the Knight of Faith are going to apply to Abraham. The night is sure of step. Abraham rose early, and he packed his ass and got everyone in order and went off. Even though we're imagining how these things are, if Abraham is shaking, then it's not, like in his later writings, Kierkegaard is going to write about how, if you have anxiety, I can't find it. Anyway, the point is that he would have done it with surety, and he would not have shook his.
And he uses the words that he says to express it. When God calls him, he says, "I'm here," and he immediately responds. He doesn't hesitate. And so I sort of see it as, here are 4 little fantasies to, get you used to this way of thinking, and also maybe foreshadowing maybe the demonic in a sense, maybe foreshadowing the ethical versus the religious in a sense. And also, once we move past this, now we're going to go into the real story and the thing that matters. So it's all about the 5th scenario. The 5th scenario is the real one. It's the ball game, right? So I think that's the dynamic. That's the tool, I think.
I think you're right. And then he goes into the next chapter, which is that's the real story. At least as poetic as you can make it, is a speech in praise of the real Abraham. And he goes on about, doesn't he start with this, to declare the difference between a hero and a poet? And they're both great things, but let's be clear what a hero is and what a poet is. And he goes and describes why Abraham was the greatest hero of all.
Why does he bring the poet into that, do you think? I found that to be kind of uninteresting.
He says the poet is all. It sounds like the poet's as important as the hero, but the poet gets its greatness through devotion to the hero, where the hero himself gets his greatness through focusing inward on himself and being the best he can be. The poet is the greatest through loving someone else as much as he or she can.
Right. But not deeply knowing the act itself. So the poet is maybe Kierkegaard writing this, trying to create a map of what this might look like in relief, not describing the thing itself, but describing around the thing itself in order to get a sense for it, which is the purpose of telling the story and praising this act and then admitting, hey, but I can't do it. Anyway, I appreciate it.
Well, Kierkegaard would be the poet himself in this story, and he's trying to describe his hero, which is Abraham. And that's exactly right. The poet tries and tries and tries to describe something that's so wonderful, but you can never describe it perfectly without experiencing it. But the boy is that poet going to try. And that's the greatness of the poet, I saw anyway.
And philosophy. It's the greatness of the poet, and it's the greatness of philosophy. Why write a book? Why write philosophy about something you can't understand? Why doesn't he just write one sentence? I have no idea, and then stop. It's because you're trying to create some kind of relief, and against the relief, you can get a sense for it. You can begin to appreciate it, and you can begin to understand the movement, even if you can't do the movement. Because he only sees 3 people of faith. There's Abraham, there's Mary, and there's that random tax dude. That's it, right? That's it. I mean, he's not saying there are only 3 people, but I think he only describes three true knights of faith, right?
Yeah.
Apparently, it's pretty hard to get to that level, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important to remember that this is De Silencio, because he writes that the poet is the genius of recollection, and he can do nothing except call to mind what has been done, do nothing but admire what has been done. And that's what De Silencio is doing throughout this. He is admiring faith, but is standing outside of it.
What do you guys think about the idea of greatness being accorded based on that which you struggle against or that which you love? So is that sort of the idea? I mean, can we put that in a modern lens or modern terms? Is it the entrepreneur who sacrifices his family life gets success, the family man, family woman who lives for raising children gets the happiness of children, but then there's one thing that we can't understand? Is that the modern lens on that? I wonder how you guys saw that dynamic, because that's in that same part, right?
Yeah, Yeah, he does say it's Nietzschean in the way he says it. It's like only the great man like Abraham, who attested to great extents like this, can achieve great things. It's all about greatness and the suffering that must be endured to achieve greatness. So it's very existential themes that carry through Nietzsche. To answer your question, how do we play it into modern society? Yeah, he talk about someone winning the lottery, and he says that someone who wins a lottery has $500 million, but they're not great. Someone who goes and like works hard and sacrifices and makes money, they are great. Not because they have the money, not because of the outcome, but because of the journey they went to get there.
Great in what sense, though? Because he would define each greatness with a different he would say there are different types of greatness, right? You get this type of greatness, you get that type. He would say the lottery winner would be great too, but great in terms of how much money they have alone, right? I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And his great is, I mean, he obviously thinks that the faith, being able to hold the faith in the toughest scenarios, still believe that good things will come even when you're killing your own son, that's the highest level, to truly believe that.
Yeah. Anything you want to add to that,
Michael? Not particular. I mean, I do think that in the modern sense, it still would be that, yeah, you can be great based off of how much you love yourself or how much you love another, but the greatest will be someone who loves God. And it's just important to know that he's, yeah, exactly what you were saying. He doesn't leave out other types of greatness, but in the end, the greatest will always be your commitment to God.
Yeah.
Or the absurd, or doubt, or, yeah.
The movement into the absurd, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I think this chapter seems to set up the framework pretty well. At least the beginnings of the framework to understand what happens later. The absurdity and the relationship between the absurdity and the universal. It seems to be sort of beginning to get set up here. I found when I was reading it, I found that I didn't get it when he was explaining it at that point, and I didn't get it until later, until I can't remember which problem it was. It might have been the second problem that I started to realize, oh, this is what he means by the universal. So I wonder if you guys struggled with that like I did, or if I'm just a dummy.
I definitely.
Which movement? Where are you?
I'm still on the eulogy, the beginning before the preliminary expectoration. So the setting up the framework in this, I didn't find it insufficient. I just didn't get it yet, and I realized after I had read further what he was talking about, if that makes sense.
It was like someone drawing a picture, and like I was reading the book as he was drawing. I'm like, what does that mean? And then you finish the book and you kind of look back at, oh, it's a picture of this. But for me, it was very much like that. It came to me in pieces, and it's still coming to me now. The resolution of the picture is getting clearer as we discuss it. I'm still only at a low bit rate.
Well, maybe we can get. Is there anything on the eulogy you guys want to cover before we get into the actual preliminary?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that he said that. So a little bit more background biblically is that Isaac is a little bit like the Christ of the Old Testament. Isaac is promised for a very long time. And Sarah, when Christ originally promises, I think it's in 8:12, 8:15, when Genesis 8:12, God promises to Sarah that she'll have a child, and she laughs. And Isaac, when he is born, Abraham names him Isaac because Isaac means laughter. So there's this first Isaac is his name is a reminder of the denial and the disbelief in God's greatness. By the time Isaac is born, Abraham is 100 years old, and Sarah's old as well, too old, which is why she laughs at God. But what Kierkegaard says is that, but Abraham believed, and therefore he was young. For he who always hopes for the best becomes old, and he who always prepared for the worst grows old early. but he who believed preserved an eternal youth. And I thought that was really interesting, that there's this relationship to your beliefs with your youth, or the sort of spirit that you have.
And, literal youth, or do you mean youth of outlook?
Not literal youth, I don't think.
Yeah, it's almost. I mean, the night of resignation, when the night of resignation gives up the finite, gives up the things of this world and says, whatever, I'm cool with everything. I still have my love, but it's depersonalized, and I have transcended, but I haven't made the leap of faith. Then the thing itself, the love, for example, becomes it becomes a singularity, and it exists in a sort of atemporal space. It doesn't move through time. It almost becomes this sort of hyperspace object. And I think that's sort of that's kind of what that's touching on. This idea of when things move toward the infinite in terms of your relationship to the things in your life and what causes you suffering, you become young in the sense that you aren't pulled by those anymore because you've sort of released them from your the structure of your anxiety, or whatever you want to call it, if that makes sense. The anxiety, the attachment, which is a very Buddhist sense, right? It's the thing that makes you old as a Buddhist is aversion and desire, these two things that are constantly pulling. And so the Buddhist, when they move toward enlightenment, they first have to accept a very existential sounding set of principles called the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is that suffering is the foundation of life. And the existentialists would say that's sort of, that they might focus on that a bit more. That's the basic assumption, and then you move on from there, and then you move toward sort of a state of resignation where you live in the world, you play in the world, you experience the world, you run to the bus stop if you're going to be late, but those things don't perturb your inner state. They don't perturb your emotions in the way that it would for a normal person. So there's a way in which the sort of, not necessarily enlightened person, but the practicing Buddhist would become a night of resignation, in a sense.
Yes, and but he doesn't take the next step, because the night of faith is being able to understand the paradoxes. So he stays as the night of resignation, I think.
Yeah,
and that's aligned to what Nietzsche says about Buddhism as well, is that it isn't all the way. It needs to go another step to become all the way.
That's interesting. I haven't read that. So he talks about Buddhism in relation to not reaching a certain point.
Yeah, he critiques Christianity a lot, but he also has some moments where he goes up against Buddhism as well. He says one of the problems with Buddhism is it's not personal, so you have to follow these 4 rules. He's like, anything that tells you to follow these 4 rules and doesn't say invent your own, like, that's rubbish. So that's what he thinks. Yeah. And he also says you shouldn't be ascetic. That shouldn't be the goal, to be ascetic. The goal should be to, a bit more like Kierkegaard. It's like, no, realize nothing matters, but act and live like everything does. And have the contradiction. But
I was trying to square the bodhisattva character, the person who achieves enlightenment and then returns in order to teach it, with the Knight of Faith, but I don't think it squares, because the bodhisattva does come back from the infinite, does come back to the plane of the common people, and come back to maybe the plane of the universal, or the plane of the ethical, or whatever it is, but there is no leap of faith element in that. There's no jump. It's come back, teach what you know. I don't think there's anything like the leap into the absurd.
The Knight of Faith can't teach. In fact, he or she can't even, and which is also something to point out, that Knight of Faith, Kierkegaard makes a pretty big deal that it is open to any category of gender, so men or women can become knights of faith or what have you. But also the Knight of Faith can't just not teach. He or she cannot even speak about their experiences, because this is completely particular to them.
Yeah.
He also talks about other movements in this chapter as well. We're talking about the preamble to the Problemato now. Is that where we're at, or?
Yes, yeah, the preliminary, right? We're in that territory, I think.
He talks about movements, and we talk about the movement of resignation as the first step. He says there's other first steps. There's obviously aesthetical movements, like a movement of love, but he says there's also movements of like humor and it's another one. But there's a bunch of first movements, but the right moves, I guess, are resignation, then faith, paradox, kind of thing.
It reminds me of the Holy of Holies, or there are in a lot of religious institutions. There's something that you do before you get to this inner sanctum. If you've ever been to Bali, there are these Hindu temples that have these gates, and it's like this gate that's been split in half and separated, and it's perfectly flat on each side. And this is meant to intellectually or mentally or emotionally prepare you to go into the holy space. You have to cross the threshold by yourself. You have to walk over the threshold on your own power, and then you enter a place that you don't fully understand, but which is beyond you. And it's the same with in the Jewish tradition of the Holy of Holies. There was a place of preparation where you would do something. There's a rite, there's a ritual, there's a thing that you must complete. But then once you've done that rite, ritual thing you have to complete, it's out of your hands. And same for, I guess, shamanism, but that's the night of resignation. That's the thing you can do, but that's the farthest you can go on your own, under your own power. You guys want to talk about the finite and the infinite? Because I think that could be confusing to a lot of people, and I kind of want to make sure we're on the same page and how I understand it.
In what regards?
Well, how would you explain that to someone, the finite and the infinite? Because I don't think I got it immediately when I read it the first time a long time ago either. How do you understand the finite and the infinite? I mean, how do you understand how the finite and the infinite relate to the progress of the individual toward faith? What is the finite?
Well, it's just the material world, I think.
Okay.
The finite is everything that is not the spirit and the spiritual world. And as he says, in the spiritual world, all things are possible, but not so in this world. Or I guess in the spiritual, all things are possible, but not so in this world. So the Night of Infinite Resignation is going to have a lot in common with the Night of Faith. And it's not even clear that you'll be able to distinguish the Night of Infinite Resignation from the Night of Faith. But they are incredibly different. And the way that the metaphor that he uses is the ballet dancer that can stick the landing perfectly and does everything perfectly, whereas even the Night of Infinite Resignation will rock or tremble a little bit. Even the greatest actor of this Night of Infinite Resignation will not be able to stick it just so, but the Night of Faith will be able to, which is short.
I mean, it's an interesting analogy. It's kind of hard for me to square in my own mind the ballet dancer. I don't quite get it. I mean, I think it's more interesting to talk about why is it that the Night of Resignation stands at the cusp of the absurd, and trying to wrap your head around what the cusp of the absurd is, and how they jump into the next thing. You know what I mean?
The Night of Infinite Resignation doesn't have to believe in God. And I think that the Silencio, the author, is a Night of Infinite Resignation. At least that's, I think, as far as he says he can go. But that's the Night of Faith that goes beyond him, that he can't get into.
And to address that, I think it comes down to the physical act in itself. So maybe this moves into problem one, but you become a Knight of Faith, someone who can appreciate what Abraham acted out without being fazed in any way. And if you can do that, not like the 4 child stories where he's like, oh, I'm scared or whatever, but if you can walk into that moment, have no questions, know in your head that your child's going to be fine, but on the other side of your head, you're just going to kill your child, and completely know and act out that motion, that movement, holding both truths to be correct at the same time, then you're a knight of faith. And that's, you are a person who lives in the absurd, and you can reach above everyone else by doing that, by holding a paradox. And it can't be done unless you do it.
Can't be done unless you do it. I have to think about that one. Yeah, I see what you mean. So and it's also interesting to contrast. I think one of the great contrasts is the difference between, and also something that's immediately hard to grasp, I think, the difference between the knight of faith and the knight of the aesthetic, or the person acting in the aesthetic, if they do the same act. Not only how they're judged ethically, but just comparing the two, how do you know you're one and not the other? One reason being the knight of faith is steeped in the ethical. The knight of faith is like a tea bag steeped in the universal first and moves out of it, whereas the aesthetic individual is below.
Right. Well, the aesthetic individual, there's the examples that he gives are like Don Giovanni and these other sort of operatic characters. This is in other stuff, though. This, like, the aesthetic, he doesn't get that much into the aesthetic in Fear and Trembling, but the aesthetic is the Seducer's Diary, is where you're going to get examples of that. And the aesthetics, I think, main goal is to make the boring interesting. And it's this pursuit of not necessarily hedonism, but it's pretty close. I think I'm not
novelty.
I'm sorry.
Novelty, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know if he would say they're hedonist, but they sound a lot like hedonists to me. So you have this aesthetic who's a hedonist, and then you have the Knight of Infinite Resignation would be someone like Socrates, who has attained this eternal consciousness, as he says, and can dwell on the eternal, but still act as if, like you said, everything matters. And then the Knight of Faith would be Abraham. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if we dumb it down to the most basic level, Kierkegaard's saying in problem one is there is a time when you could kill your son, or at least try to, or kill him. There is a time where that is not a sin, and actually, there's probably a couple of different times where that is not a sin. There's an ethical suspension where it's like Agamemnon has to sacrifice his son to save the nation, and that's okay. There's also like the aesthetic suspension, where if you did it, we can't get it's the end, but if you kill it and then don't tell anyone about it. But the highest level of suspension when you are allowed to kill is if you do it believing completely in the absurdity, then it's okay.
Well, God has to tell you to do it, though. Like, I don't think that you can just do it on your own. I think that.
How do you know it's from God? A .gov email address? How do you know?
That's the question, and I think that's what he wrestles with, is that you have to take that responsibility on, but no one can tell you, and no one can help you.
But there are characteristics of it. There are features of it, right? I mean, because one of the features is the nature of the temptation, because the nature of the temptation for the Knight of Faith is to fall into the ethical, into the universal, and the nature of the ethical is to fall into the aesthetic. It's sort of like a waterfall mechanism, right? The temptation of the Knight of Faith is to default to your own ethical sensibilities.
Yeah.
Right.
I think right. I think yeah, I mean the characteristic of the religious hero over the ethical is that the particular is more. What would he say? The particular is more important than the universal. The particular is more correct than the universal. The particular has risen above the universal.
But the particular is also the aesthetic particular. There's the aesthetic particular, and there's the religious particular, right? The religious particular has to be one steeped in the ethical. They have to be the one who's tempted by the ethical, and then also I think the other characteristic is their not speech is not a fear of the ethical. Their not speech is an inability to speak, because if they speak, it means nothing.
So, in this part where he says, like, is it bad to kill someone? Like, there's a reason for. is there a reason when God can tell me to kill someone? I like this sentence here that says, he says, we don't get many people like Abraham these days, but we know them when we see them, because they say, this quote, the future will show that I am right. And please judge by the outcome, not the means. So if I'm going to kill Luke, and
why did you choose me? Choose Michael. I
was pointing with my right hand, and you're on my right side of my screen. But I'm going to kill someone, and I believe that the future will show that I'm right, and I believe that my outcome is going to be proven to be right in the future. That could be, that's a teleological suspension right there.
Do you have that page number?
But outcome can't be. You can't judge based on outcome, right? Because judging based on outcome invalidates the leap of faith, right?
Yeah, I didn't think that was right, but I wanted to see the page number, because for me, if Abraham had killed Isaac, it's very much not clear that would have proved to be the right action down the line.
He has to kill Isaac, knowing full well that Isaac will die right then and there. That's what makes his faith real. He has to be able to actually plunge the knife.
Historically, I heard reading another book that actually in the original Jewish version of the Old Testament, he did kill Isaac and he was dead. And it got softened and changed because the Christians couldn't handle that brutality. So they just changed it. No, he's saved, or a sheep came, it's fine.
That's cool. I'd like to read that version.
Right.
How does that play out? Do you know? Does he come? Is he just a zombie son after that? How does he bring him back?
But I was thinking Dostoevsky talks about the extraordinary man. I think it's a similar sort of parallel. And Nietzsche talks about the Übermensch. I mean, these are similar types of people who they will do what it takes, and they'll break the rules for a higher purpose.
But that can't consider the consequence.
I mean, I think that's the interesting. That was one of my questions. I was going to ask both of you, who do you think is the stronger individual, Napoleon or Abraham? Because Nietzsche gives Napoleon as the example for his Übermensch, and obviously Kierkegaard gives Abraham as the knight of faith. And I mean, the idea, I think, is that, look, there are going to be, you can live ethical, but eventually, if you want this sort of even stronger sense of the particular, you need God. And that's what Nietzsche would totally disagree with, right? He doesn't think that you could be stronger with God. You're much stronger without God. That Christianity weakens you to some extent, right?
Yeah, but I mean, God for Nietzsche is more like just a will to power. And I would say a will to power is just another kind of construct you put up there and go, oh, that's your God. Just like Kierkegaard says, the absurd or the paradox is God. Faith is doubt. It's like it's playing with language and words. They're all talking about the same thing. It's like what is the cardinal virtue that you align yourself to and direct yourself towards?
There's also a distinction to be made in the consequence as relates to an example that's worth choosing, and the consequence as relates to the nature of the faith. In other words, and I kind of said this a couple days ago, but basically, Abraham has to be able to plunge the knife and know that his son will die, and simultaneously accept the absurdity that he will somehow get his son back, even if he does do that. But if he does do that, then he's no longer a great example for Kierkegaard to choose to write this about. He has to choose something else. Maybe he chooses Mary, or maybe he chooses that tax collector dude, or whatever. But he has to choose somebody else because it's no longer an interesting example and becomes more Job-like in the lens that it provides. Because Job, the book of Job, is a mechanism, and the story of Abraham is a mechanism by which we understand God and we understand faith. We understand God and faith through Job because Job is this thing who withstands, the flame that withstands all other things except for the ultimate power of God, which can be capricious, can be whatever, but can't be fully comprehended, and that's what Job sets up. And the flame is his faith. His faith is the secondary thing. It leads him up to the ultimate power of God, who then says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And then he has to bow to God. So you get this sort of crystalline structure of God is incomprehensible, you're nothing compared to God, you can't understand the ethics of God, and faith is the thing that can get you closest to that thing. Whereas with Abraham, even if he had killed Isaac, it's about his faith, right? So it becomes more, because Isaac is now taken away, it becomes more of a Job sort of story, right? But for Kierkegaard, he needs Isaac to not die. He needs God to stay his hand in order to have proof of sort of concept that this is actually a thing worth having, if that makes sense.
I see your point. Yeah.
Michael, you're doing this. It makes me think like you don't agree. So what do you think?
Still question why God would possibly want why they would. I mean, God promised Isaac for so long, and then he's just going to take his kid, and that's part of the absurdity. Although, I know I still agree that we probably emphasize about different aspects of the story, but I still think that that factors in that God is active and was completely comprehensible. Why did he do that? But I'm not sure that we could still talk about the particularity, and that there is just some explanation that Abraham alone understands. That Abraham, like, there is just some reward that Abraham gets in following this particular concern.
When you say that reward that he gets, I mean, what's the basis for that in the text?
The reward,
the irrational belief.
The reward is the absolute relationship with God.
Yeah.
To me, it is following that particularity all the way through. It is not something that is comprehensible or able to be explained to someone else, but this relationship with God is certainly what we should all be striving for, and the yeah.
Should we move on to? I mean, do we want to tear more off the bone for problem one? And if so, what is it? Or should we move on to the second course of problem two?
Yeah, I wanted to mention one. I wanted to ask one more thing about problem one.
Sure.
And this is not specifically in the text, but is something that we can just speculate on. Does the ethical, and maybe we can bring, because I haven't really read much Hegel, because it sounds pretty hard to understand. Can the ethical or the universal, does it make room for the sort of zeitgeist, the shifting ethic, the not? It is the ultimate, it is the ethical, but does it allow for that ethical to sort of be whatever as long as it's the consensus? Is it the ethical of any culture, or is Kierkegaard trying to make a case for some sort of ethical that transcends specific culture? I don't think he really talks about that, does he? And I just wonder if that it leaves room for the zeitgeist to do its thing.
Yeah, I'm not a Hegel expert. Like, I don't understand his book after having tried to read it, but at least and there's memes out there that say Hegel didn't say that. So like, I'm going to be at risk of like quoting Hegel out of turn. But I think he calls that like the collective morality is like the collective conscious, and it is dependent on the zeitgeist. So if the spirit of the time says something is good, then that's good. That's what I think. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I mean I'm just trying to establish if that's my understanding of Hegel. I'm just trying to establish if that's exactly what Kierkegaard means by it as well. If he means to establish some sort of rigid structure or some sort of thing that's permeable and amorphous and can shift over time.
Well,
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Direction to history. So even though it might be true that what is the zeitgeist is right now, it is not what's ultimately right. There will be another end in this thesis. There will be an antithesis that will then provoke produce a synthesis, and that will be what's right then. And then we'll have another within that synthesis, a thesis, which will produce an antithesis. We'll continue to move in this sort of this
I'm getting some weird echo. Are you hearing that too, Ryan? From Michael, when you speak, I'm getting a sort of echo thing where it seems like your voice is doubling or bouncing off the wall and coming back again or something.
Okay. I don't know.
I think I understand what you said. I heard synthesis.
It's intermittent. But yeah, Hegel, I think, talks about absolute rationality, and he thinks rationality is the highest and above sort of irrationality. I think they're opposed. I think Kierkegaard says irrationality is the highest, actually, and having a relationship with irrationality and with absurdity and with the paradox via kind of illogical belief, which is found often in stories, like the story of Abraham and Isaac, says that's the highest. And I think he would oppose Hegel's view of systemization and logification.
Seems to be one of the reasons he's writing this is to oppose Hegel, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
He's refuting Hegel at every point.
Like Hegel says the outer is better than the inner, and Kierkegaard says the inner is better than the outer. So Kierkegaard's like an innie, Hegel's an outie.
What?
I'm gonna get that as a tattoo.
So is there any absolute duty to God? Problem 2. Can I ask a question about that, or do you want to?
Yeah, ask away.
So I think the key thing here is that what is the difference between the religious or the teleological movement and just any other aesthetic movement? Like, I can say I'm going to kill Isaac in the name of love, in the name of like humor, in the name of in the name of beauty, in another aesthetic movement. And why is it this movement of faith is somehow better than any other aesthetic movement?
Sorry, say again.
Great question.
Was I completely gaff that?
No, it's good. I just had to think about it. Maybe reading that quote from Luke could help frame it.
Which one?
If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
club to be part of.
I guess your question is sort of like, how do you distinguish the aesthetic movement of any random sort,
right,
from receiving faith,
right?
And how do you know that that's true, and how can you be validated in that, right?
Yeah.
By Kierkegaard's judgment.
Yeah. Like, he puts faith above other aesthetic passions as the highest, and I'm just like, okay, well, why particularly is it the highest then? Is it like he gives us the reason because it's a paradox and it's higher, but I don't. And maybe it's the hardest to understand, because maybe we can put ourselves in the position of someone who loves, or someone who finds beauty, or someone who whatever. We can put ourselves in those shoes, but putting ourselves in the position of a man of faith or a woman of faith, that's super hard. Like, I can't put myself in Abraham's shoes.
And how do you distinguish that from a schizophrenic who stabs somebody because they heard a voice, right?
Right. Maybe it's that.
So a couple of things. I mean, I think one of them is just the idea that, yeah, you're not a Christian, so you wouldn't understand why faith is the highest. But the other thing is that I think there's definitely the idea that faith is where you will derive the most strength out of any of the passions. I mean, the reason why you stick that landing perfectly when you're the ballet dancer, as the metaphor for the Knight of Faith, is because you have faith. And you can't do it if you were the Knight of Love or something else.
And there might be some sort... Yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah. I was just going to say that like, this is where you derive the most strength. And that's kind of why I was maybe poorly juxtaposing Napoleon and Abraham. It's because, like, some would say, yes, Napoleon led these armies and was able to conquer so much, but the way that Abraham rises early in the morning, does not pause for a moment and takes the knife out and is going to stab his son, that is something that no one without complete faith could do. And that's why Abraham is the father of faith.
Well, you have to. I think you have to triangulate though, because if you say it's just that, he gets up early, he says, "I'm here, Lord," or whatever he says. If you just say that, then the schizophrenic can meet that criteria. They can say, "I heard a voice," stab someone in the face, and be perfectly confident doing that, right? So it's a matter of triangulation too. There are other characteristics, and you're not saying what it is. You're saying what it isn't, and by saying what it isn't, you create a picture of what it is in relief, if that makes sense. So that's part of it, but the other part of it, sort of by triangulation, is the fact that you are exiting from the ethical sphere rather than coming up from the aesthetic sphere. You are a person who understands the ethical sphere, and you're transcending the ethical sphere. So you belong there, and then you pop up for that, right? So you live on that plane rather than living on the plane of the aesthetic. Also, you have the nature of speech, right? The person who is in the aesthetic sphere doesn't speak because they fear retribution from the ethical domain. They fear the judgment from the ethical because they live in the particular. They live in the particular, meaning they live in their private sort of decision-making processes and satisfy their own ethical urges, and don't say something for fear of what people will say of them. Whereas the person who lives in faith doesn't speak because if they speak, people may say, "What are you talking about? I have no idea." So all of these things, and probably more, come together to sort of create this relief within which we can sort of say, I kind of understand, but it doesn't but the psychotic, the schizophrenic can't satisfy all those criteria. They might be able to satisfy one, but not all, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. I think also the schizophrenic just won't have this sort of strength that the Knight of Faith will have, and even that seems to be very important to Kierkegaard, is the surety of step and the taking delight in everything and all of that. Like to me, a lot of, at least what I was really fixated on with reading the story of Abraham and Isaac, is the degree of confidence that I just feel like the schizophrenic would not be able to replicate to the same extent that the Knight of Faith would be able to. But there's also one if we want to do a question, because we have 30 minutes.
We have 30 minutes.
Yeah, we'll take some questions.
And the Knight of Resignation also, if the Knight of Faith becomes a Knight of Resignation first, the Knight of Resignation isn't perturbed by all of those desires that the schizophrenic might be perturbed by, right?
Yeah.
Do we have any questions?
There aren't any questions, so I guess we must have done a really good job.
Comments, yeah.
This problem too was hard for me, but I like the way, Michael, you addressed it, because really I can put myself in Napoleon's shoes. I could even put myself in Hitler's shoes. I could put myself in these bad people's shoes, but putting myself in Abraham's shoes is really hard. I don't think if I had a son that I love, that I would just get up and be completely stoic and be like, "All right, son, time to die," and just stab him or go to stab him for no reason at all. At least Hitler had a reason. He thought he was doing something really noble and good. He's the tragic hero, even though he was messed up. And you have Napoleon did these things for a reason. There's just no reason for Abraham that anyone else can understand except for him. It's a deeply, deeply personal reason that only he can understand, which makes it very experiential. You have to experience it, which is the whole point of Kierkegaard, is that faith is experiential.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if there's no God, then Abraham looks like a crazy person, crazier than schizophrenic, right?
Yeah.
And it's written in such and such a way that it you can imagine that, right? God appears at the beginning and says, "Here I am," and he says, "Take Isaac, and I want you to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah," and then he's gone for the whole story. And Abraham gets Isaac, and they go, and there's nothing from God. And you can just take out that beginning, and you see this very disturbed man who is just taking his son to die and is about to stab him without an ounce of regret or it's interesting that Abraham doesn't have the Garden of Gethsemane. There is no God, do I have to do this? There is unquestioning, I'm going to do this. And yeah, I mean, I think that is also what Kierkegaard is pointing out as like, you want to go beyond faith? Are you even close to this?
Yeah, that's why he constantly brings up the reminder. He always says he is either a psychopath or a knight of faith. He's one or the other.
Yeah.
Dan asked a question, and we can answer that if you guys want.
Does Kierkegaard think he could give a non-religious person any reason to believe Abraham is a murderer or a madman? Anyone want to take that?
Address that real quick? Is that it's like Camus in The Stranger, who shoots the dude on the beach. It's absurd. I think in the exact same way. And Camus was the biggest atheist, but that's my 2 cents. Michael, Luke, what do you think?
I'm going to reread the question.
I'm going to reread it as well. Does Kierkegaard think he could give any non-religious person any reason not to believe Abraham is a murderer?
Like, was Meursault in The Stranger a murderer or a madman? He was neither. He was just absurd. And I think that is what Abraham is as well.
Yeah. I sort of see it as a return to instinct in a way. And it's something that's kind of hard for, I think, modern Western thinking to get around. But it's the idea that instinct is, in a sense, the primordial, archaic man's domain. Everyone, we read before, we were reading Jung, right? And we read about archaic man the first time we met up. And archaic man essentially lives as Abraham. They don't need all of these questions. They don't need all of this. They go on these sort of basic clues. They create patterns, and then they build on that as almost like instinct. And so there's an extent to which I think Abraham is tapping into that sort of primordial, ancient, instinctual layer of the human consciousness that might be the collective unconscious or whatever, and that's what it is ultimately, even though Kierkegaard wouldn't put it in those terms.
I disagree, though. I think that this is clearly a case where it's not instinctual. If Abraham was angry or he wanted to do it because he was annoyed at his son or needed extra food or some primitive reason, but this is what makes it so weird and uncanny, is that he doesn't act in a primitive, natural, instinctive way. He acts like in this absurd way. I don't know.
But what about archaic man is not absurd, though? The rituals, there's a lot of that which is or does come across as absurd. I'm not talking about animals, but I'm talking about archaic man, ritual, that sort of stuff. There is a lot of that.
It's more like the tragic hero because it's done for societal reasons, not for individual reasons, I think. But
perhaps you might be right about that.
I think that Kierkegaard might say that this is why it's actually the best proof, some of the best proof of God that you have, is that the only way that someone could have the strength and surety of step, as we've been talking about with this Knight of Faith, the only way for anyone to be able to accomplish that, as Abraham did, is because he had faith and because God exists. So if God doesn't exist, there'd be no way for Abraham to have pulled that off the way that he did. And again, I just don't think that it would be able, if it was like, that's, I guess, what we're trying to focus on, is that the strength that Abraham derived from his faith, if it was in reality derived from madness, he would not have had that strength. So I don't think that a non-religious person would be able to make sense of this story. In fact, I think that it is, like Kierkegaard would say, better proof that God exists rather than that there's something to take away from it if God doesn't exist.
What do you make of the idea that two knights of faith can't communicate with each other and can't draw strength from each other?
Well, that's the idea that the particular is higher than the universal in terms of the religious. So they have their own journey.
Right. In other words, your transcendent experience is as absurd to me, a fellow knight of faith, as it is to any other person living in the ethical.
yes.
Because in every other respect, I'm a completely reasonable person, except for this one thing in which I have transcended into the absurd. So when you tell me about you're absurd, you're nuts, and you can see that in modern politics and stuff. But it makes total sense to me. I think some people might not agree with that and say, oh, they should be able to commune, but they can't commune because they're like two dots up here, and they're totally different dots, and they're far away from each other in a sense.
Can we go to the third one? Because I'm conscious of time. Like, I know we can keep going all afternoon, but I wanted to see, is now a good time to go for problem 3, or is there more in problem 2 you wanted to drill into?
There's nothing on problem 2 that I think we didn't talk about that I wanted to talk about. So I think we can move on to that.
Michael, what about you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Was it ethically? Go ahead.
Well, so this one was really interesting to me because it's about lying, and
let's read it though, because in case people aren't sure what it is. Was it ethically defensible of Abraham to hide his intentions from Sarah and
Eliezer?
Yeah.
Isaac. Yeah. Like, and he didn't tell Isaac, "Hey, we're going to the mountain because I'm going to kill you." He didn't lie and say, "Hey, we're going to go to the mountain because we're going to have a picnic." He really didn't say anything. He didn't tell his wife, "Hey, I've got to go do this thing with the son." He come back. He didn't even say anything happened. So I just think that's interesting. Like, when do we lie? And Kierkegaard goes through this whole chapter and talks about aesthetic reasons for lying, ethical reasons for lying, but then religious reasons for lying. So I want to see if we could tease apart those 3. Like, when should we lie? I mean, I thought it was interesting we talked about the aesthetic reasons for lying as well. And I thought about, when my ex-girlfriend would say, "Do I look big in this dress?" And I'd say, "No, you look beautiful," or whatever. But like, that's an aesthetic reason for lying, because you lie out of love. You don't want to hurt someone's feelings. But yeah, when should we lie? And why did Abraham lie?
Before you guys talk about that, maybe it's important just to sort of make it clear that there's a difference between the particular aesthetic and the ethical. And the ethical demands disclosure. The ethical requires that you say something, whereas both the aesthetic and the religious don't require it. One forbids it, and one makes it painful to do, right? So that's an important thing to clarify, I think.
Yeah, the ethic, that was new to me. Like, the ethic requires disclosure. It's like, wow, actually, that's kind of true. Like, you, as I said before, you go to court, you're asked to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's like, this is an ethical platform. You have to tell everything in matters of truth, and you have to tell all of it. But the aesthetic platform or the religious platform doesn't require it in the same way. Because
the aesthetic is self-satisfaction. It's masturbatorial in a sense. That's all it is. Whereas the ethical requires disclosure, because the ethical can't exist without disclosure, because the ethical derives its power from the collective conscious, where people have a common understanding about what's cool, what's not cool, what's happening, memes, and so on, right? There is this sort of consciousness that must include people saying what happened.
There's a quote that I like, and he says that aesthetics called for concealment and rewarded it. Ethics called for disclosure and punished concealment. So I just thought that was a interesting way to...
Which is why the aesthetics don't speak. They don't speak because they constantly fear the ethical.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to point out that I don't think Abraham lied. It's more strong than that. It's that he could not tell the truth because the truth just did not have linguistic capabilities. So I thought that was...
And he brought in irony, which is the interesting thing. He both avoided the truth and hid from disclosure. You're allowed to hide from disclosure because if you speak the absurd, because you exist in faith and in the religious. And you can't lie, because if you lie, then you fall into ethical judgment, or you become maybe even an aesthetic type, right? So you have to hide, and you're justified in hiding, because if you disclose, you destroy the act, and you negate what you're about to do.
There's 3 types of heroes that I got from this chapter, which I thought was really interesting. But he says there was the aesthetic hero who can speak but will not, out of love kind of thing. The tragic hero who sacrifices himself for the universal and discloses himself for the universal. Like, I'm going to speak up and I'm going to be the sacrificial lamb for the sake of everyone, and that's the tragic hero. But for Abraham, none of those apply. It's what you said, Michael. He doesn't speak because what he did is beyond words, and it cannot be expressed in language. He's more like speaking in tongues, if you were to describe it. So the religious and the paradoxical cannot be expressed in words. That's why Abraham doesn't speak about it.
Yeah.
I like the line he says, "The tragic hero demands tears." That's great. Meaning that he does it for the reward. He does it to bask in it. Ultimately, he does it for the recognition on the ethical level. And when after he does it, he can sort of just get in a floaty and sort of float along in the milieu until he gets old, and that's fine because he's in the system. That's not related to the lying point, but I thought it was an interesting line. Michael, go ahead. Wait. Can you say that again? I couldn't hear you clearly.
I was saying, do you want to talk about the prologue as well? Because I thought that the prologue actually had a lot of really, what we brought up before, about learning from older generations and feeling like we're much farther along than we actually are. But I just wanted to know if that's to other people too, because I found that pretty striking. In what other ways is that kind of resonant for things that what things do we take as inherited that are actually needed, necessary to build?
That's an interesting place to go, but maybe since we're on, especially on problem 3, we can go to that next. So I actually wanted to bring up the demonic urge, because there are a lot of interesting stories. The merman story expresses the demonic, and it seems like there's a sense in which the demonic transcends this framework that's been constructed. Do I understand that correctly? The demonic transcends the framework. It doesn't fit in the framework exactly.
This part was hard for me to understand. He gives a number of stories and examples of concealment, like disclosure versus concealment, when it's right, when it's wrong, when it's aesthetic, when it's ethical. He talks about the example of the bride and groom. Yeah, the groom sees the bride on wedding day and realizes he doesn't want to get married. So he sees he has 3 choices: remain silent and get married, remain silent and not get married and just leave, or should he speak to her about it and tell her, hey, this is how I feel? Like that, and he walks through the aesthetic and the ethical implications of those. Then the merman story, that was pretty cool as well. The merman, I guess, is like a mermaid, but he seduces this young, beautiful woman on the shore, Agnete. But when he's about to seduce her back to his underwater lair and like take her, but he sees the look of faith that Agnete has in her eyes and how much she loves him and trusts him, that he can't bring himself to do anything bad to her. So
parallel between him and Regina. That was one of those things again where he was considering like having this is the least sexy thing in the world, having carnal relations with her. But he was considering that, and then but because of how faithful she looked, he just.
What would have been the demonic option for Kierkegaard in that setting? As far as I understand, the bride who accepts the demonic option for the bride who accepts the one who has 7 husbands who have died before. The demonic option is the one in which she doesn't tell him and he dies. Is that correct?
I can't remember that one.
Yeah. I'm interested in the demonic because I didn't quite get it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It seemed like it was outside of this framework we've been setting up the whole time, and then there's this concept of the demonic, and I'm trying to get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very complicated. Are there any specific passages that you could point to?
No, it was just in the 2 examples. There was one with the merman and there was one with the bride who had 7 husbands, but I don't have the quote in front of me. And I don't know, read it too quickly, but I'm not quite sure where I'm trying to fit it into the paradigm that's been established throughout, and I can't seem to find a place for it. It seems like a capricious act that does ill to others is pure evil and pure selfishness, and transcends the aesthetic, transcends the ethical, and transcends or somehow outside of the faithful or religious. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we're all confused about it. I don't feel so bad. Cool.
It's a really hard book. Like I was reading it, and I had to reread paragraphs, and when I finished it, and I'm still like, as I said, I have a rough sketch of what he's trying to get at, but you could read this 50 more times, like before you could really understand it, I think.
Yeah.
So, and the last chapter was pretty hard. It was quite difficult, and I didn't understand the demonic part of it either. I like the stories about how all the girls he's trying to date and what would happen if he married her or left her. You can tell that's a personal dilemma for Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
I consider him to be a bit like John Mayer. He's just a bit of a bad boy that way. God.
Cool.
But I mean, yeah. I think I could go through it more for the last chapter, but I also could make mistakes. So maybe it's a sensible moment to move to the epilogue and look at that. I don't know what you think, Luke.
Sure. Yeah. Let's do that. Michael, you wanted to talk about how to what extent we pick up on or we stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us, and to what extent we have to grapple with things each and every generation. Was that your thought?
Yeah. Right.
Can you put that in the form of a question, though?
Well, I mean, the idea is, are there other things besides faith that I guess I was kind of taking it outside the text and thinking about, are there other things that we think we inherit that are in actuality something that need to be built like faith?
Yeah, like these books, like I'm reading now, like reading Nietzsche. I read Nietzsche before when I was like 22 or something like that. But I read a couple of his books, and it just didn't do anything for me. It was like reading words. I'm like, oh, cool, that's poetic and nice and beautiful. But I read it now, like 20 years later, and because I've had life experience, like buckets of life experience, the words hit me in a completely different level in a different way. So I think it needs to be both. It needs to be like this knowledge that we get through books and ideas, but it needs to mesh with life experience. If you don't have both, you have knowledge without understanding. And knowledge without understanding is very cheap. But knowledge with understanding understanding is very hard fought. But knowledge with understanding is like the highest you can get, because not only do you have the knowledge, but you understand it experientially.
Yeah. And a good example of that would be confronting the shadow in terms of sort of Jungian psychoanalysis. When you confront your own shadow, that is each and every time, even though you might have archetypes, myths, dreams, and things to sort of not necessarily guide you along, but give you a framework or give you ideas about what's happening. Oh, there's a symbol. Why am I dreaming about a horse eating a carrot? Whatever dream it might be. There might be a framework that you can glance at in mythology. There might be a framework in terms of maybe reading Jung or whatever it might be. But the journey itself, going down into your own shadow and understanding your dark side so that you can protect yourself against becoming a person who can be used by anyone else to do evil things, become a Nazi or whatever it might be. The confronting the shadow journey, the hero's journey of going into yourself and slaying your own dragon, is, in a sense, that sort of internal act of. It's not an act of faith, but it's the same sort of thing that you have to. Each and every person has to do it if they're going to do it. Otherwise, you're just a person floating down the river on a raft. Right.
Yeah. I think experiential is a big part of it. He says, to talk to your point, Michael, he's about previous generations, right? We have all this knowledge that's been handed down in books, I guess, and now the internet, through generations and through other mediums as well. And that's all great, but we can't use it unless we have that personal, passionate experience to apply the knowledge. And I think in today's world, that's part of the problem, is people think they know things because they know a superficial idea that they saw in a tweet. and they're like, well, they read some news article for 5 minutes on XYZ and think they're now going to go and protest about it. But they haven't, maybe they haven't experienced it, and maybe they haven't read the whole book about it either. They just read the headline and they formed an opinion without the deep, deep understanding of the topic that they're trying to have an opinion on. And what he's saying is that you can't pass that type of understanding down through generations. Knowledge can. The understanding needs to be built anew for each person, like the ballerina learning to dance properly. It needs to be built anew for each of us.
Sort of walking the line between. There's a book that's not very popular called Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson. Yeah, it's all right, but there's an interesting idea in the book, which is the individual, every individual stands at the nexus of chaos and order. The mother is chaos, the father is order. They stand between their own mother and father, but they're also in their own culture standing at the sort of precipice between, or on the ridge between, their culture that is sort of entrenched and what has been taught to them and what they've been steeped in as children, as they grow up and as they play, and the unknown, which is the future, which is where things go. And ultimately, the engine of change, the thing that moves the cultural zeitgeist in one direction or the other, the thing that allows for novelty to be created in the maybe cultural sphere or religious sphere or whatever sphere, is the individual who grasps the feminine, the masculine, grasps the merits of order and the importance of chaos as a force of creation, as the maternal force of creation, and then strides forward to build something ultimately. Even if it's not an intentional type of building, it's to create something new that then becomes part of the telescoped culture within which the next generation will grow up, and then they'll continue to carry it forward. So I sort of see it like that process, and I think the Jungian model of confronting your shadow is similar to that as well.
There's so Kant says the same thing with freedom and nature. I think it's similar to order and chaos. And Kierkegaard is looking at the rational and the irrational. So these two opposing ideas, the dichotomy of the two ideas. And this is the ongoing debate: which is supreme? Is logic supreme? Is illogicality supreme? Or are they equal, sort of dancing between each other? And so Kant says they're equal. Hegel says logic is supreme. Kierkegaard says irrationality is supreme. So I think that's the ongoing question, is
what does Ryan say?
I personally believe that rationality is a product of irrationality. It's like a child that we had, and I think we can have more childs. I think the brain is a new thing. It's only, as far as it can consciously comprehend, have memory, and have idea of truths. I think that's a new thing that's only been around for, say, 10,000 years. And maybe we'll evolve a new faculty that's like a faculty of rationality, but a completely new faculty in the next couple thousand years. And the reason why Christianity is our God right now is because we're worshiping rationality. You can see that it's put rationality into the theology, and that started with Pythagoras and went till now. I think probably with the age of Aquarius, we're at the dawning of a new type of faculty. It's the next one after rationality. What is the next faculty? Maybe it's a faculty of love, or maybe it's a faculty of empathy, or maybe it's a faculty of humor, maybe it's a brand new faculty we don't have. And then we're going to have a whole religion based on that new faculty that we worship instead of rationality.
Do you think that's I'm just curious, do you think that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, Age of Aquarius, we receive it as this sort of thing and then we make it that, or is there some sort of ontology that's moving us around?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just curious why you said Age of Aquarius. I don't know what the heck that means.
Where did that come from?
Pulling astrology out of nowhere in this very nice conversation, and you destroyed it.
What is Age of Aquarius? What? That just...
Yeah, I was thrown for a loop by that as well.
We need to...
A mystic. He's a mystic.
Yeah, I am. Because like Pythagoras, right? He intuited mathematics. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. Chaos is the center. Rationality is like one satellite. It's like, does the Earth orbit the sun, or the sun orbit the Earth? Well, the Earth orbits the sun. So chaos is the sun, and Earth is just a planet. Like,
what? What is this conflation of metaphor? You're like, so the sun is...
Because I'm trying to speak outside of terms of rationality. I'm trying to speak in like illogical terms.
You're being Kierkegaardian in your way of expressing yourself.
Yes.
I think the thing that's interesting is the way that the pendulum may or may not be swinging in terms of the way that we store information culturally, because for tens of thousands of years we stored information culturally by spoken tradition, by practices, by myths that we carried out, that we learned from elders. Now we transmit cultural information impersonally. We do it through books, we do it through the internet, we do it through videos. We don't do it in the same way. So I'm interested to what extent that maybe the pendulum has swung too far and we're moving maybe closer toward the rational side, and maybe there is a middle point. I'm not sure, but I think that the cultural transmission mechanism is interesting too.
For me, I just thought that, look, I thought it was a great lesson in close reading as well, because I thought that Kierkegaard is basically saying, so you all just heard the story of Abraham and thought it was no big deal, just like passively digested it, but this guy almost killed his motherfucking son and none of you care. Like, that is... Can we talk about how crazy this story is? And I thought that invites you to go back and look at these other stories and look at other things that you passively just kind of accept as true or not that fantastical, and be like, holy shit, either Abraham is absolutely a madman, or he either a murderer, or it's a sacrifice, or he's a believer, or, like, what are the other things that we've kind of passively digested without really appreciating how deep and kind of multi-layered, polyvalent they really are.
I agree. I think that's the theme. Is like, look closer, and that's what to talk about your idea, Luke, of like the superficiality of information being transmitted in books and the internet. It's thinning out the information. It's not the same as experiencing it, being told by an elder, and you're experiencing information firsthand. So I think that's what Kierkegaard is calling back to. It's like, no, let's look closer, come closer, experience this information more closely than just a headline, and let's really recognize how complex these things are. You can't simplify them into a little story.
And I also think it's important to keep in mind, I agree with that. I think it's also important to keep in mind and sort of look at it myopically, in a sense, or without your glasses on, let's say, and appreciate that there is wisdom and deep intelligence and insights far back into the past that you have to sort of dig into and look at, and you pull up these gems that you hadn't considered before. One of them is this leap of faith that we discover in a thinker who isn't always regarded as very important, but this is a real work to grapple with. And I think, when I read it, it reminds me, and I mentioned this before, of shamanism. It's another one of those things that you have to grapple with. If you don't grapple with shamanism and the parallels between shamanism and this, you're missing something. Because there is that ecstatic, irrational, sick man on the edge of town who has also been steeped in his culture, but is also ridiculed by his culture, and acts in each and every moment as an insane person who at the same time is able to benefit the village through his visions and his predictions and his maybe remedies or his advice. So it's this very interesting sort of parallel to the irrational as a source of inspiration and a source of good to the ethical layer, or the collective or the culture, and that exists in probably more places than we might suspect. And this story is a sort of a wake-up call to sort of look around for it. I see it in shamanism, I see it a bit in Buddhism, and I'm sure it's probably a lot of other places too.
It's also in Shakespeare.
In what?
It's also in Shakespeare, where the madman or woman is usually the fool, is the smartest of everyone in the play. And if anyone would just listen to them, then the whole thing wouldn't happen. Right. But we are over time, and we should probably say thank you so much to everyone, my God, for listening to us talk about Fear and Trembling for 2 hours.
Can I finish on some quotes a couple of, like 3 short quotes that I liked? Is that all right?
Yeah.
As you were.
So I liked, and please add your own quotes as well. I don't have to be just me. But the true knight of faith is a witness and never a teacher. What he won was not won on the cheap, so he does not sell it on the cheap. And he knows what is truly great is available to all. So I thought they were cool.
I have none because the downside of listening is that I can't remember anything specifically. It's a failing. Michael, do you have any zingers?
But I guess
Give us a zinger to end on. No pressure.
Okay. I guess the zinger would be something like I don't know. Well, yeah.
We can't end with horse sounds. Come on. I like the tragic hero demands tears. I don't know why, but that really smacks of the essence of the tragic hero and the essence of the cultural domain, the universal and the ethical sphere that we live in now, is that nobody does anything for a real reason. If you donate 200 masks to a hospital, how great do you feel about yourself, and where do you seek your adulation? That's what it is.
Yeah.
Well, guys, thanks a lot for the chat.
Wait. I can't end on like you said, so I gotta go with the beginning.
Hit us with it.
It's
we're live, dead air.
Okay, all right. It's
we're building the suspense. That's what's happening now.
This is welcome to NPR.
I'm trying to find a specific.
I'm just waiting. You guys have not taken a sip of anything this entire time. I've had a coffee and then gradually transitioned directly into gin, which is it's a pretty nice transition. Yeah.
Really, you're on gin already, dude.
Well,
cool.
I sort of it's my ritual with podcasts. I go from coffee to some form of alcohol. I do it with almost every podcast. I don't know why. It's just something I started.
I have a quote from Kierkegaard that's not from this book, though. It's one of my favorite. Well, Michael's looking.
Yeah.
But he says, I have to read it over here. So I'm going to look off camera. Do you not know that there comes a midnight hour where everyone has to throw off his mask? Do you believe that life will always let itself be mocked? Do you think you can slip away a little before midnight in order to avoid this? Or are you not terrified by it? I have seen men in real life who so long deceived others, then at last their true nature could not reveal itself. In every man there is something which to a certain degree prevents him from becoming perfectly transparent to himself. And this may be the case in so high a degree, he may be so inexplicably woven into relationships of life which extend far beyond himself that he almost cannot reveal himself. But he who cannot reveal himself cannot love, and he who cannot love is the most unhappy man of all.
And mine is, if there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the foundation of all there lay only a wildly seething power which writhing with obscure passions produced everything that is great and everything that is insignificant, if a bottomless void never satiated lay hidden beneath all, what then would life be but despair?
It's at the start, right? That's toward the beginning. It's a good one.
Yeah.
That helps to really punch you in the face with the angst. And when you get punched in the face with the angst, you pay attention and the stories resonate. So that's important that he does that at the start. It's a good one. All right, guys. We hit 2 hours and 3 minutes. Thanks for the conversation. I hope we can do it again.
Thanks for having us on, Luke.
Yeah.
So much, Luke. And thanks
everyone.
everyone.
Talk to you guys. Yeah, thanks for everyone watching. Bye.
Bye.